You are watching the Poor Boys Horology podcast, the podcast for watch enthusiasts on a budget. Your host for today's podcast is Dr. Ed DeVries, an amateur horologist whose personal collection includes Timex, Rolex, and everything in between. If you are interested in dive watches, dress watches, designer watches, military watches, automatic watches, hand-winding watches, quartz watches, or pocket watches, the Poor Boys Horology podcast is about to become your favorite podcast. So click like and subscribe. Then sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode of the Poor Boys Horology podcast.
Welcome to the January 2021 episode of the Poor Boys Horology podcast, our first podcast for the year 2021. It's great to be here doing a series of shows for yet another great year. I say great year, I don't know. I'm guessing 2021 can't be any worse than 2020. Anyways, today we're going to talk about Vostok wristwatches. And then in the second half of the show, I'm going to compare my two favorite dive watches, that being the Vostok Scuba-Dude with the Casio Duro. But before we do that, let's have a quick wristwatch check. I am wearing a Casio F108. It is a Illuminator, just basically old school, a digital wristwatch. Literally picked this thing up at Walmart for $8, but hey, gotta love them. And now we're going to have a brief 45-second commercial from our friends over at the Barnes Review, and then we're going to dive right into today's Poor Boys Horology podcast with an overview of the various offerings of the Vostok Watch Company.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Vostok Watches. Those who are regular viewers here on the Poor Boys Horology podcast know that I have an affinity for Vostok watches, particularly those that were manufactured during the Soviet era. I've got a couple of the Soviet era watches. They're older than I am, and all I can say is I put them on my wrist, I wind them up, and they work. And they're just a beauty to behold. But Vostok watchmakers, what I want to talk today about are the various models that Vostok is making. Now, all of the Vostoks in my collection are either Komandirskis, which were the Army issue watches, or Amphibias, which were their Navy issue watches. But Vostok has actually put out quite a few different watches in the last couple of decades, and so I want to kind of look at the overall Vostok offering today. Let's start by saying that Vostok Watchmakers is a Russian watchmaker. They are based in Tatarstan, and they create mechanical watches with rugged military aesthetics, movements. They also make clocks. Most of their watches have mechanical movements. They have a number of brands that they make: Vostok, Vostok Europe, Volmax, Polho International, and the Moscow Classic line of watches. They also own a company called Briolet, which is the producer of the ruby jewels that a lot of different watchmakers, even Swiss watchmakers, are using in their products today. And so let's look at their brand history, if you will. They were established in 1942, and it got its start when one of the first Moscow watch factories, watchmaking plants, got evacuated during World War II to Kristopol. And this is a very small town in Tatarstan. It's near the Kama River. And during World War II, basically defense equipment was being manufactured in this facility. And as the war ended, the company's production, if you will, shifted to making watches for the Vostok company. But it wasn't until the 1960s that the Vostok brand name was really born. Before then, they were making watches under the name of Rakita and Polho, and Vostok became the official supplier for the Soviet Union's Ministry of Defense in 1965, and that's when the brand really took off. That's when the brand really became noticed. Their first line of watches was called the Komandirsky watch, and it was issued to the Soviet Army. And then shortly thereafter, the Amphibia was released. It was a dive watch made of stainless steel that could withstand 200 meters underwater, and it was the first watch really to be able to do so. By 1980, Vostok was churning out 4.5 million watches per year. I mean, that was just phenomenal. And these watches were kind of like 1940s inspired. So they were making watches in the 80s that were like watches from 40 years ago. And the brand also started manufacturing luxury watches in the 80s called Kremlevskis. And those were made in a limited quantity, and they were targeted to a high-end European market, as well as some people who were just really high up in the Communist Party. And won't really go into a lot of detail there. But let's look at the watches that Vostok is offering today. And the first is the Amphibia. And this is their dive watch. And it was produced continuously for almost a half a century. It didn't go through a lot of changes except for a few styling upgrades. That word Amphibia is often regarded as engineering and integrity design solution. And so it was a good name to give to these watches. The main idea behind the Amphibia and behind this dive watch is to do what all dive watches do, which is to avoid the ingress of water during submersion into water. And so it's designed to maintain the watch's ability and function operating underwater, even as, of course, the deeper you dive, the more pressure comes against the watch. And the Russians actually figured out how to use this to the watch's advantage. Over the decades, for example, the creation of dive watches have gone through several redesigns. But the Vostok didn't need this. In fact, if anything, the redesigns are trying to make the other brands of watches more like the Vostok. And what the Vostok does is the Vostok, other dive watches, they have seals inside them, gaskets. And those gaskets are capable of withstanding however much pressure. But the Vostok Amphibia was designed differently. It didn't have the gaskets. Instead, the case of the watch, as the pressure increased, the case of the watch would close down or clamp down upon itself. All of the different pieces of the design would clamp down upon themselves, making the seal tighter and tighter and tighter the deeper the watch went. So this watch was able to go far deeper than any other dive watch has ever been able to go. And so that's the Vostok Amphibia. I have several of them in my collection. I think they may be the greatest watch that's ever been made in the history of the world. But there's another model. It's a newer model, and it's made by Vostok Europe, and it's called the Energia. And the Energia takes its inspiration from space systems. It's the namesake of the powerful space launcher that was used by the Soviets from 1976 to 1987. And then there's the Lunokhod Hod 2, another Vostok Europe offering. The last of the two unmanned lunar rovers that the Soviets sent to the moon, allegedly, are the Lunokhod and the Lunokhod 2. And allegedly, the Soviets landed the Lunokhod 2 on the moon in 1973, and allegedly it operated for 4 months and picked up a lot of moon dirt and brought it back to the planet Earth. It also sent 80,000 television pictures and 86 panoramic images back to the Earth, and was deemed to be the longest of any robotic rover on a celestial body. Again, I say allegedly. Personally, I don't believe that the Americans successfully sent men to the moon in a ball of tinfoil held together with chicken wire, let alone do I believe that the Soviets sent robot cars there either. But anyways, that's a subject of conversation for a different show. And then another Vostok Europe model is the Almaz Space Station. And this is a watch that we have pictured on the screen here. and it was named for the space station. And then there's the Ankar. It's another Vostok offering, and the Ankar is considered the fastest submarine in history, holds the record of 82.8 kilometers per hour. It was fully named the Soviet K-162 Ankar. It was built back in the 1970s as an ultra-fast attack submarine made with a titanium hull. The Ankar is the predecessor of the Alpha-class submarine, and it's the Soviet submarine of choice during the Cold War. Then there's the Gaz-14 Limousine, and this is kind of a unique-looking watch, as you see it there on the side of the screen. Referring to the government luxury car, the Gaz-14, it's one of the Soviets' biggest achievements in terms of their automotive history, and it was designed exclusively for the use of its high-ranking politicians from 1977 to 1989. These cars were 7-seaters, and they featured an advanced technology and just all the bells and whistles. They were there. And these cars were far more comfortable, so I'm told, than any American vehicles that were made during the same time. In fact, the Gaz-14 became the foundation of several designs of American cars in the post-Soviet era. Then there's the Rocket N1 watch here, which is a chronograph model. And the N1 is a super heavy rocket design that the cosmonauts of the Soviet Union were planning to use to go to Venus and to the moon and to other places. It was Russia's answer to the Saturn V rocket. And so apparently the space exploration program inspired a lot of Vostok's offerings. Of course, the name Vostok itself comes from that capsule that Yuri Gagarin, the first human to have ever successfully gone into space and come back alive to tell the tale, he was launched in what was called a Vostok capsule. And so it only makes sense that the Vostok line would be inspired by the Russian space program. This next watch here is the Expedition, which is a nice looking watch here. And it's also named for a Soviet Union spacecraft. The Expedition was used to study the North Pole, basically. It was like it flew over the North Pole. Then there's the Mireya, and that word means dream. It was created by a team out of Kyiv, and it was a transport aircraft, and it set a whopping 106 records all in one flight. It was made to carry piggyback loads that were otherwise too big to fit into the fuselage of a regular cargo plane, such as the Buran space shuttle of the Soviets. And this watch here is inspired by it, and it's just a beautiful watch. If anybody wants to get a hold of one of these and send it to me, I will not in any way be ungrateful. And then there's the Ekranoplan. What a name, Ekranoplan. Look at that orange there. And finally, we have the Ekranoplan, and it's the Caspian Sea Monster. It's the largest type of this vehicle that's available today. The Ekranoplan was actually kept a secret by the Soviets for a long time, as it was undergoing testing from 1966 to 1980. How they kept it a secret for so long, I do not know. But it was essentially the world's largest cargo plane. And somehow or another they managed to keep that a secret. But Vostok watches have really built their reputation. And they put together a great team, and their watches, they're cost-effective, they're stylish. In 2009, Vostok started collaborating with Swiss companies and putting down a foundation for just solid watchmaking that's going to serve them and the world well for years and years to come. And so, is Vostok a good watch brand? I get asked that question, and let me just say, for the price, for the money that you'll spend, they're one of the best that's going. Vostok models such as the Amphibia and the Commandeersky are good military-grade timepieces. They're tough. They use 19,800 beats per hour, 31 and 32 joule self-winding mechanisms. They can operate by design without requiring any maintenance for at least 10 years, even longer if you use them carefully. I have 1960s build Amphibias in my collection that have never been to a watchmaker. and yet I still wear them frequently, and they work well. As I said, the Amphibia watches are great dive watches because they can go up to 200 meters or more. They can withstand the underwater pressure. They're great for scuba diving. They don't fight water pressure using brute force as other watches do. Instead, as I said, they get tighter and tighter as the pressure increases. Vostok watches are assembled using parts and movements that are made, designed, and built in-house. Not all watchmakers can say that they do this, and so as a result, the parts are easy to get for a Vostok when you want to mod it or repair it. Some users even claim that Vostok watches are more dependable than Seikos and Orients, and they claim that because of the high-quality guarantee that comes from Vostok. Let me say this, the Vostoks were made for the Soviet Union's Ministry of Defense, and they made these watches to be able to withstand the rigors of Army, Navy, Air Force, Special Forces, and even space flights. So again, the quality is there. Some people even call Vostoks the G-Shock of automatic watches because their construction is a lot different from other brands. The crown, they do need a little bit of getting used to, but because of the wobble in the crown, you're not going to break it there. You're not going to damage the inner movement like you can with some other watches. They have a vintage look and feel to them. Like I said, they're nowhere near as expensive as other brands. They've got a great history to them. That's why they have such a loyal following, including myself. So where do you buy your Vostok? Well, I would suggest going to RU Store at Amazon.com. I talked about those in our last video. RU Store at Amazon.com. Great people to work with. They're not paying for this endorsement, by the way. They have no idea that I'm recommending them right now. I've just bought watches from them, and they were great people to work with. And so this is a group of people you want to go to, RU Store at Amazon.com. You can also get them affordably on eBay. The difference being that the RU Store at Amazon.com, they keep an inventory in the United States, so you can get 2-day free Amazon Prime shipping, whereas with eBay, you've got to wait for the watches to ship from Russia. And sometimes that can take a couple of months. So there you have it, our review there of Vostok watches. Now we're going to break for a brief commercial, and then we'll be back. I'm going to do a comparison of my two favorite dive watches, those being the Vostok Amphibia Scuba-Dude and the Casio Duro. One of our big sponsors here on the Poor Boys Horology podcast is TBR Magazine, the Barnes Review magazine, and one of the contributing editors at the Barnes Review is my good friend Harold Scharnhorst, Harold Hestovich Scharnhorst. Harold is someone who I have enjoyed interviewing several times on both of my radio shows, and you know, if this weren't a horology podcast, I would interview him right here on this show as well. But Harold had a tremendous story to tell. When he was a little boy, his dad basically raised the army that repelled the Nazi invasion of Norway during the Second World War. And so Harold grew up with a dad who was basically the commander of the Norwegian Armed Forces. He was the leader of the Norwegian Underground. And then when the war was over, Harold and his family immigrated here to the United States. And Harold ended up enlisting in the United States Army. He ended up working some very interesting jobs. Currently, he is a professional photographer, writer, and broadcaster living in the state of Idaho. And he took all of his story and he wrote it down in a 470-page book. And this 470-page book has over 300 photographs. And the book is called An Immigrant Remembers. Harold sent me a copy of this book about 2 years ago, and I read it, and the story was fascinating. I could not put it down. An Immigrant Remembers. And you'll want to get your hands on this book. You really will. And you can do so. Of course, you see it on the screen, the cover of An Immigrant Remembers by Harold Hestovich Scharnhorst. And you can go to Harold's blog, www.halscharnblog.blogspot.com. That's www.halscharnblog.com. harold.halsharnblog.blogspot.com. That's up on your screen right now. You can email Harold homefrontbooks@alpinemontana.com, or you could go to Harold's Facebook page. Again, all of these contact informations are on your screen, or just mail $30 to Homefront Publishing, P.O. Box 55, Moyie Springs, Idaho 83845. Again, it's on your screen. You want to read this tremendous dynamic book, An Immigrant Remembers. It was a story that as I was reading this book, I just couldn't put it down. And you won't be able to put it down either. And so you'll want to read this great story, An Immigrant Remembers by Harold Hestevitt Scharnhorst. Go back, hit rewind, hit pause, so that you can get your hands on this contact information and order a copy of this great book, An Immigrant Remembers by Harold Hestevitt Scharnhorst. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on the 6 differences between these two timepieces. So let's get started. Of course, on the left we have the Casio reference DV1, and then on the right we have the Scuba-Dude made by Vostock. I also changed the strap on both of these watches. They both originally came with rubber straps, and I've replaced them with red and orange NATO straps. I chose those colors. The red on the Duro makes that red second-hand pop, and then of course the orange on the Vostock makes the orange on the dial pop. But let's look at the differences between these two watches. There are quite a few similarities. Of course, their price points are similar, and the Casio Duro is about a $40 watch. The Vostock is about a $60 watch. They both have 200 meters of water resistance. They're both readily available on eBay and Amazon and at other websites. Both watches are extremely popular. Both watches have a cult following. Both watches are fantastic watches. And even though they're in a similar price category and kind of competing for the same type of buyer, I think both watches are quite different, and every collection should probably consider having room for both of these timepieces. So what are the differences between these two watches? Well, the first big difference is the styling or the design. I have eyes, obviously I can see that these watches have a slightly different appearance to them. So let's first talk about the Casio. Obviously it has a styling very similar to the Rolex Submariner. It's not exactly a copy of the Submariner, but I would call this a homage. It does definitely pay tribute to the style and the looks of the Rolex. The same bezel, the same color scheme, and so forth. The Casio, however, has its own identity. It's not a blunt copy. The Casio comes in a 44 millimeter, whereas the Rolex is a 40 millimeter. I think the new Rolex Submariner is 41 millimeter. So the Casio is going to wear big on your wrist. Casio also has 2 other color options for this. You're looking at the black on black here. They also have a blue on stainless steel, and with the Amphibians, there's just such a huge variety of dials and bezels and designs that you can choose from, and they're also easily modded. In fact, I've replaced the bezels on most of my Vostocks. You also have a lot of different strap options. Of course, the straps are easy enough to change, but you can really make these Vostocks your own creation. You can go to the Merom website, which is a Russian website, and you can custom make your Vostock, your own hands, your own bezel, your own case, everything. But this watch here is about 39 millimeters, and so it's more closer to the size of the Rolex. It doesn't fit quite as big on the wrist as the 44 millimeter Casio Duro. If you have a smaller wrist, the Vostock will fit it well. And that brings me to the second thing, which is your wrist presence. As you can see, the Casio is bigger, and so it wears big on the wrist. It is a slim watch, however, so it doesn't set too tall. I think if this watch came in a 40 millimeter case diameter or even a 42 millimeter kid's diameter, it would work much better. But still, you know, sometimes I like to wear a big watch, and so the Casio definitely fits that bill. Now, when it comes to the Vostock, it wears a little better on the 7-inch wrist. It's got a domed acrylic crystal, and that makes it sit a little higher on the wrist, a little thicker. Of course, both of these watches look really good on NATO straps. The NATO straps just seem to work really well with these watches. They don't seem to dig anywhere. And then origin. That's the third area of discussion today is origin. The Casio originates in Japan. They've been made in Japan since 1946. Of course, Casio is a huge electronics company. They make calculators. They make keyboards. They make all kinds of things. They're probably best known right now for their G-Shock watches, which are the U.S. military issue watches that are virtually indestructible. The Vostok, on the other hand, is made in Russia. It originated, at least in these Amphibia models, in the 1960s is when they began to make these. Of course, as we talked about earlier in today's show, the Vostoks, they started making them way back in 1942 during the Second World War. Let's look at the movement of these two watches. They both have very different movements. The Casio is powered by a quartz movement, and it has a battery life of about 3 years. It's a reliable movement. It's an accurate movement. The Vostok has a in-house movement, comes with or without a date complication, and it has 31 or 32 joules. Beats it just under 19,000 vibrations per hour. Has a 31-hour power reserve. Amazing specs for a watch in its price point. It's a workhorse. It's robust. It's pretty much indestructible. It's not the prettiest movement to look at if you take the case back off, but it gets the job done. Some people think these watches are very accurate. Some people say they're inaccurate. They can be adjusted. If you take them to a watchmaker, they can be adjusted, and you can get these things to operate within 5 or 6 seconds a day. Some people complain that they come out of the box as much as plus or minus 2 minutes a day. Again, let's look at the bezel. The Casio has a 120-click unidirectional dive style bezel. It's hard to move. It's a very stiff movement, but you can move it. It does the clicks. You can use this. So it's a functional dive watch. Gets the job done. The Vostok, on the other hand, most of their bezels don't click. They are friction movement, which means that if enough of a bump is applied to them, that they can potentially move. And so some people have expressed concern with that when using them, say to time your dive or whatever. And this is also one of the reasons why I've almost always modded the bezel on my Vostoks. I really like the Seiko dive bezels that they pop right onto those Vostoks. Of course, this is the one Vostok here that I've kept the original bezel on. Let's look at finishes and quality. I think the Casio has a slightly better build than the Vostok, mainly just because it's got a more polished case. They use an acrylic crystal that, unlike the domed crystal on the Amphibia, the Casio is less likely to scratch, although you can polish out the scratches on the Vostok Amphibia. I've scratched my crystals and the scratch polished right out with toothpaste. The crown, of course, it takes a little bit of getting used to. The winding stem, because it wobbles on the Vostok, but that is a safety feature actually, so that you don't accidentally damage the movement. Both watches, the Casio and the Vostok, I think are a little difficult. Their screw-down crowns, I think, are a little difficult. But both watches are built well, but I think that the Vostok Amphibia is built like a tank. Doesn't have as polished of a finish, but it's a durable watch. It'll get the job done. You have an unsigned crown for both watches. You have a screw-down case back. And so there you have it, the 6 differences between the Amphibia and the Duro. Which watch do I really think is the better of the two? That's hard to say. If I honestly believe that the Duro is the best dive watch, the best quartz dive watch out there, I believe to be this Casio Duro. For the price, you just can't beat it. Seiko and Orient and some other companies have a, nicer build dive watch. Yes, they do. But you get all the functionality and a good-looking watch for $40 with the Casio Duro. You just can't go wrong. And the Vostok Amphibia, for the money, is the best automatic dive watch going right now. And so on that note, let's break for a commercial. And then we'll be back with the closing segment of this month's Poor Boys Horology podcast. Phone with our good friend Clint Lacey. So your newest project is you've started a publishing company, Foothills Media, and you'll be publishing 3 tremendous books. The first of those is your book, The Beginner's Guide to False Flags. Why don't you tell us just a little bit about that book?
If you were wondering how we ended up at this point in our history and everything's going on, Beginner's Guide to False Flag takes you from the beginning of the country until the election of Donald Trump, Charlottesville, the rise of the communists, and the Russian collusion hoax. The rape of Delaware County is a story in which a United States veteran defended himself against a known drug felon, only to find out that the local police were in on it. Crooked prosecutors, and one of those prosecutors was actually arrested coming back from an island in the Caribbean in a murder-for-hire plot. And it just details just how corrupt one small county can be. And in the book, I said that Delaware County, Oklahoma, in the past was a safe haven for outlaws from Missouri and Arkansas. And what the reader will find out, it still is. Blood in the Ozarks, expanded second edition, 156-year-old government cover-up in which out-of-control Union officer led his men to murder men, women, and children at a Christmas gathering in the Missouri Ozarks. I founded Foothills Media in 2019 because I'm dedicated to bringing you the truth.
Thank you, Clint. I know that our listeners are going to want to check out Foothills Media, so tell them how they can do so.
Well, you can visit us at foothillsmedia.net, and that will take you to our website where you can browse the books, read our blog posts, and catch up on news that you won't find anywhere else in the mainstream media. foothillsmedia.net.
My dive watch collection has Seikos, it has Orients, it has Ticinos, which I call the Italian Rolex, not really. It's a beautiful Submariner homage, but it doesn't quite have the quality build of the Rolex. I've got a Hayakuchi 101, which I call the Japanese Rolex. I might review that in an upcoming episode of the show. I even have an Omega Seamaster in that collection, as well as several Invictas. But my 2 favorite dive watches genuinely are the Casio Duro and the Vostok Amphibia. I've got several Amphibias in my collection. My favorite of those, of course, being this Scuba-Dude, which, if you remember from last month's broadcast, was one of the watches that I actually got for Christmas this year. Anyways, we are at the close of the broadcast right now. So what I want to do is I want to encourage you to become an advertiser here on the Poor Boys Horology podcast. And we have a great deal right now, $15 an episode. And your commercial can appear on an upcoming podcast. And of course, once these things are up on the internet, they'll stay there, hopefully forever. And years from now, people will still be tuning into these podcasts, and they'll be watching your commercial. So consider that. The email address is on the screen. We're going to have one final word from one of our sponsors, and then that's going to be the end of the show. But we will be back again next month. Be sure to click like and subscribe. Give us the thumbs up. That'll really help our channel quite a bit. Anyways, I always enjoy doing these shows for you, and I'll see you again next month on the Poor Boys Horology podcast.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. and find out about the American Free Press, do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.